third video is really going to suck. Because the third video is how to change the entire transmission for 50 cents. I had to invent a lot of things to change this transmission. I didn't finish doing it because where I was working on it, they were threatening to tow me if I walked away from the car. I had to take 3 buses while I was covered in grease every day to and from where this car was. And the whole thing was effort, which most importantly, the whole thing was an effort which is against my religion, if I may use that word as a colloquial term. This is a transmission mount. This worked great. This has got a little thing. I welded it together for 60 bucks. That's buying the metal and welding it, actually. Something like 90 bucks with welding it and everything. And it goes on this jack right here. See how that thing's plugged into that? This thing is on a circle. This is just a AutoZone jack. But you put this whole big square on the circle. This is custom fit for the weird shape of the bottom of a Crown Vic transmission because it's got a lumpy thing on the bottom of it. But this fit in perfectly, and then you put straps through here, wrap it around the top of the transmission. That settles that. I had to make some other thing which is hidden down there, which I yip-yapped about in another video. I won't go into it. It's difficult. You must be clever prying the crosmMnr out. The first thing is emptying the transmission. A good way to empty it, way better than taking off the whole bottom of the transmission pan and all that, is to see which of those 2 hoses that leave the bottom of it, one is hot, one is cold. While it's running, before you do the work, you see which one's hot, and you know which the hot one is the exit one, because then it cools down in front of the radiator, which, believe it or not, there's transmission fluid in the radiator. It's got its own little transmission section, power steering section, and all kinds of sections. Air conditioner section. There's like 5 radiators where people think there's a radiator. 2 radiators, one behind with antifreeze and one in front with like 3 or 4 more things. One of them is transmission fluid. I must make this short because I could talk about this for an hour. You find the hot one while the car's running before you fix the transmission. That's the exit. I listened to someone on YouTube whose name I shan't mention, but they were wrong, and it ended up making the transmission fluid spill out on the ground. So you know the hot one. There's 2 little tubes on the side of the transmission. You loosen one, and you can run the engine again before you start taking it apart. And the engine's turning, it's turning the transmission, spinning the transmission pump, circulating the fluid through the front and the back. And there is not 5 quarts in the Crown Vic or other cars. There's about 13.5 quarts. Most of it doesn't come out when you change the transmission fluid. It's in all kinds of things, one of which is the radiator. That's only about 2 or 3 quarts. It's also just hidden in the back of the transmission, and much of it is in that big donut, the torque converter, and in all kinds of little passageways in the transmission. But it's 13.5 quarts. You can make about 7, 8, 9 of it come out just by loosening the top hose where it makes a loop and it's about to go in the transmission, putting a little L piece of plastic on it, going down to a bucket, and you've emptied twice as much as you would have taken out the transmission pan already. And then you can put a tube down it, which I got a tube right there, $7 at Advanced Auto. I have it for other things, so I did not spend any money on that tube. Still at 50 cents. And it's got a pump, and you stick it down the transmission full tube, and you can pump more stuff out of the transmission pan, the bottom of the transmission pan, even though more came out that would have come out if you took out the pan. And then when you tilt the transmission, more of it will pour out the front, etc., etc., etc. There's a lot of tricks, and in the end you can get about 10 or 12 quarts out, and then finally when you're picking up the transmission to leave it at the junkyard, which you have to empty the fluid anyway to do that, all the transmission fluid will dump straight on you and ruin your car. But at least it will only be 2 quarts. It will only cost you stinkN-cNts. So that's that. After that, every single bolt's difficult. I'm gonna wrap this up in 2 minutes. I'll say how to do the entire transmission in 2 minutes. People always say stuff on YouTube. It's often not true. Every repair I've done, it turns out that you didn't have to do as much stuff as people say if you're clever and wiggly about stuff. I don't know, the oil housing filter gasket, I didn't have to do almost anything but tilt the car and take half the oil out and half the transmission fluid out, and all the stuff they did, I didn't have to do it. You have to be clever. Motor mount, they said you have to change the oil, take out the oil filter. You don't. You can take the left motor mount around the oil filter without ever touching it, and so on. So everyone says when you change the transmission, you have to take the exhaust out, which is rusted to itself. Very difficult. I don't think you do. Some people said one side they didn't have to take out. You might not have to take out any of the sides. You may have to take out just one part of one side, so it bends out a little bit, and then you can get to the wires and disconnect them. So there's a lot of BS, man. That's all I'll say. After that, after you've drained the fluid out, park the car, lift it up on all 4 wheels, then beneath all this garbly gobbledygook is the end of the tail shaft. There are 4 bolts. They are 12 millimeter. They are 12-sided. They're not 6-sided. You must use 12-sided sockets on a 12-sided bolt, or you'll strip it or something. And you must spray it with a lot of this. I can't see while I'm looking through my camera. I'm like, something like this everywhere, maybe the day before. And use a long wrench and clonk it with a hammer. Get them things loose. Then take the whole big drive shaft that goes up the transmission, wiggle it a little bit, turn it, and it slides out, and it's way lighter than it looks. It's all aluminum. Careful not to dent it on when you lower it. That's the draining the fluid, which is a big part of it. The exhaust, which is a big bullshit part of it, but it's very difficult to take off exhaust bolts. If you end up taking out the exhaust, maybe you do have to for this or that reason. The one on the upper right on the Crown Vic, you must use a 1/2 inch long bar with extension, because a 3/8 inch will bend, and then the bolt will not, the socket will not be flush with the bolt, and it'll go boink, and it'll pop off and round the bolt as well. You must use a thick, this isn't it, this is a cheater bar, but you must use a thick extension for that. Getting off the exhaust is a pain in the butt, but in any event, so far, you've drained the fluid. What else have you done? Talked about how the exhaust might not be necessary to do it all. Be wise about that. Taking out the drive shaft. Then, after you do all that, and that, the fluid's gone, the exhaust is out of your way, drive shaft's out of your way. At some point, you can put one of these penguins underneath the transmission when the time deems fit. Because still, after taking out the drive shaft, no big deal. The transmission is still up there resting on the transmission mount. The next thing to do is get rid of the crossmember. I bent 7 crowbars trying to get rid of my crossmember the first time. It wasn't no Girl Scout picnic. It was no picnic. Never mind, Girl Scouts might be really tough. It was no picnic, but I did it. I made my own transmission lever that grabbed the edge of the crossmember and went like this, and I pushed it up and put a jack on the other side of it, and the fulcrum was the chassis of the car. I'd jack up this thing, and it would push down on this thing and grab the transmission thing, and 1 inch at a time pull it down. I had to make my own crowbar. Major pain in the ass. Don't believe me, Google it. Then you take out the cross member. Don't let it crash onto the exhaust pipes. When it's almost out, let it fall gently. Catch it. Then you take every single plug that's around the transmission off. Have to figure out each weird rubber plug. You could take a picture of it before you do it. Take them out. 7 minutes and 50 seconds. I want to finish this by 10 minutes. You take out the plugs. Then you take out, in this order, that then you put the jack underneath it. You take out the transmission mount, which I said how to do in another video, not very difficult. Then you unplug each thing on the left side of the transmission. On the right side, at some point you must unplug the starter, which is kind of annoying, and put that up aside, tie-dye it, then go over there to the driver's side, unplug each little thing. There's one thing with the wire that's got like 1 bolt. Take the bolt off. Then you go like this, you take this wire and you just leave it dangling there. And you've already unplugged all the wires around it. Take a picture first and unplug all the wires around it. Now you're left with the transmission on the jack, which it must be before you take out the back transmission mount or whatever. And now what is left to do is take out all the bolts. When you lower the transmission with the jack a little bit and a long extension, you can get to those 2 annoying bolts. That's one way to do it. There's 2 annoying bolts on the very top. They're hard to get to. The rest are 13 millimeter. They're about 35 foot-pounds. Take them out. Then take now the transmission is totally ready to take out. Take the back tail in. Go to just break any rust seal that's been created, and catch the transmission, which is already tied to the transmission jack. And I wouldn't use this one because the transmissions are front heavy, and they have a way of tipping over towards the front and trying to tilt your whole jack over. I tied the tail end to the actual jack itself, and still it was tipping over, so I had to always hold it. In any event, after all that, then finally you go like this with the tail, you break the seal, move the jack back, and it's going to try to tip over if you don't buy the real jack. If you buy this one make it your own jack, and keep it balanced, and then slowly lower the jack. Wheel it to the side of the car, which must be jacked up to like 21 inches, and then crawl out of there, holding onto the jack so it doesn't tip over. Pick up the tail end so the jack tips, and the bell housing does like this and becomes lower. Pull it out of your car, and the reverse is in the reverse order, and at all costs, if you're clever, you have to think then.